Mike Jay is a critically acclaimed author and broadcaster.
I originally started writing about the history of drugs about 10 years ago, but I found it was a subject I kept on coming back to because it was so full of these rich and untold and unsuspected stories. I think most people's assumption, and mine certainly to begin with, was that drugs were these things that just kind of entered modern culture in the 60s and they'd always been illegal. But of course, they weren't illegal a century ago. Opium and cocaine and cannabis were all legal. You could buy them all in high street chemists. And they'd all had different histories and come from completely different parts of the world.
In High Society, Mike will explore the spread of recreational drug use around the world and reveal the history of the global drugs trade.
Every society is a high society. Every society has its own intoxicants, has its own rituals, has its own habits, has its own taboos, its own vices. What's happened in the modern world, in the process of globalisation, is that every society has discovered every other society's intoxicants. So what I want to do is to explore all the ways in which drugs, both legal and illegal, have made the world what it is today. And to get a taste of that, we'll be going to China to look at the history of one particular notorious drug, opium. From the very beginning, drugs were central to the emergence of the global economy. Columbus's discovery of America, he was looking for a different sort of plant commodity, spices, but what he found were plant drugs that became enormously popular in Europe. Tobacco, and in fact the whole idea of smoking, had never existed outside the Americas before Columbus, but it spread through Europe like wildfire, and then European traders, Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch and British, used it to open up new global trade routes around Africa, into Turkey and Egypt and India and across Asia. But the market that they really wanted to crack open was China. The Chinese took to tobacco just like everybody else had. It became the world's first truly global drug habit. And for a while they exchanged it for their priceless luxury commodities like silk and porcelain. But after a while they started growing it themselves. And there was another problem, that they had a drug that the British became completely addicted to. Tea. In desperation, the British cast around to find a product that the Chinese wanted in return. When the British colonised India, they inherited the richest opium plantations in the world, in Bengal. They reorganised them into a vast industrial agribusiness, producing hundreds of tons of opium and auctioning it to British traders in Calcutta. The British government couldn't be seen to trade the opium directly with China, who'd made it illegal, so this is how they worked it. By this stage, the British had the fastest trading ships in the world. So opium clippers, which were these big, fast, sleek, they were kind of like the drug-running speedboats of their day. They'd come up the South China coast up to the Pearl River Delta, and they'd usually have a cover story that they were bringing Bibles in for missionaries, was the usual one. But then they'd put in at an uninhabited island out in the bay where by prior arrangement they'd meet a Chinese smuggler's boat, scrambling dragons they were called, or centipedes, of 50-oared fast rowing boats, and there they'd do a pre-arranged deal, opium for silver, and then the Chinese smugglers would take the opium up to deserted spots further up the coast and beach it there. The Chinese were outraged. What the British were doing, in today's terms of the modern war on drugs, was the same as Colombian or Mexican drug cartels. They were smuggling a prohibited drug into China, they were corrupting local law enforcement, they were addicting Chinese citizens, and they were making a fortune. In the end, it came to all-out war. The Chinese seized £2 million of British opium and destroyed it by dumping it in the sea. The British sent gunboats and pounded their harbours to rubble. At the end of the Opium Wars, Britannia ruled the waves and occupied the island of Hong Kong. This is a city whose fortunes were literally built on opium. And here, in the centre of Hong Kong's business district, is Jardine House. This is the headquarters of Jardine Matheson, who were the most notorious opium smugglers of the 1830s. Now a huge import-export business. Their building is also home to JP Morgan and to the purveyors of the latest Western drug to attempt to colonise China: coffee. So that's another way of looking at the opium wars. Opium was a drug, but it was also a commodity, and it was the West's first concerted attempt to sell its consumer culture to the Chinese. Like the modern fears that China is taking over the world, the opium wars were followed by a fear that the losers would take their revenge. So China went from victim to scapegoat. Opium became a focus for fears that the Chinese were infiltrating the ports and ghettos and underworlds of Western cities. And the opium den came to symbolise their sinister influence, the Yellow Peril. And as these images multiplied, calls grew for opium to be banned, to save the West from the fate of China. And by now, the British medical profession was abandoning opium for new synthetic variants. In 1898, Bayer Pharmaceuticals launched a super-strength version of morphine that they advertised as the best cough medicine ever. It was also, like morphine, widely promoted as an opium substitute for weaning addicts off their habit. It was the drug of the future. Its brand name was heroin. So what I really want to do with High Society is to follow these stories of where these drugs came from in the first place, because these are global stories that will take us to all kinds of unexpected places, and they're stories that are told through an amazing set of characters, pioneers of science, pioneers of culture, pioneers of exploration. The story of cocaine from the Andes, from South America, where it was used for thousands of years, and then the story of its development unfolding in Vienna with Sigmund Freud before it makes its way into Victorian London and becomes a high street commodity, and you have stories like Sherlock Holmes and Jekyll and Hyde, reflecting the availability of these new powerful stimulant drugs. Cannabis, by contrast, a completely different story. Cannabis takes us back to Napoleon and the discovery of Egypt and the French colonial influence, the Club des Hachachines in Paris. These stories open up the big questions about drugs and our relationship with them. Why does one half of our society demonise them while the other half has accepted them as part of normal life? In High Society, we'll be tracking these questions back to their origins and using history to illuminate one of the most controversial aspects of the modern world.